Oh,
Sustaining.
sustaining.
I'm just sort of saying the word several times, and I'm thinking it's an interesting choice we've had in choosing that word particularly.
Yeah.
So I guess it implies in it some sort of stability over time, a continuity of well-being over time.
Yes.
And somehow, in the notion of sustainability, is that field conditions will change, situations will be different, but some I can control and others I will accept. And yet somehow we keep reaching for continuity of well-being over time, which is feels very out of what sustains us, of course.
It's really interesting because I'm very aware that as I'm sat now, and you're bigger to me, I'm very reminded of some of the conversations that you and I have had, online. And it's like, of course, I'm used to seeing you frequently. And instead of that, we've had this distance and online conversations. And if I think of saying the word sustaining, I come to this point of thinking, gosh, how do I sustain myself? How do we sustain the work? What have been some of the themes that have been around? As you say, as the field has changed. And I'm particularly aware of a conversation where I said to you, in my mind, it's like there's this idea of the healthy field, the healthy, nourishing field that I can reach into that supports me. And I've never been more aware of what a privilege, even having that as a state of, as an idea, let alone as a state of being, what a privilege that has been and how sustaining that is. And how even losing bits of it this year, what that's faced me with.
Of course, for most, I think the Western world, and I think I say that with a sweeping generalization, I think it's fair to say there's been a lot more stability over the last 70 years and change. People of our generation, younger certainly, may have had parents that have witnessed major upheavals and wars, but most people living in Western Europe or States or Australia haven't. And I guess what's come really home this time with the pandemic and other life, world events is we can't rely on this continued sense of sameness, some sort of implicit assumption that that life will continue as it was, but rather, sort of really come starkly. And I think that's what I'm finding in my work. People are realizing that, what has been termed as black swan moments are here. The unbelievable will happen. And for many, this pandemic is exactly that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I know some of the conversations that we've had have touched me deeply, because I guess as we've reached into some of those moments and had some of those moments, I remember sort of, as you know me well, so I'm a person, I love to go on holiday, holidays. And so this year I ended up, in a caravan on a sort of Cornish coast in a gale and with nowhere to go. And I couldn't leave because, it was unsafe to sort of get off this campsite. And just thinking that whole notion of how the field changes and how that then, I suppose, showed up in our work on ethical presence, but also in this theme of sustainability, where I guess we've talked so far about managing and acknowledging. And I feel I've been confronted with both managing and using my power to manage situations, but also the privilege of some of the field conditions that I've grown up with in this country at my age, that very acute sense of we may have had the best of it for a while. There's COVID, but there's also climate change, and there's also been the political sort of crisis, I want to call it, in this country, and certainly I guess in the States, and thinking, what if the field isn't going to continually sort of sustain itself? What if we all have to do something quite radical and dramatic to, what if it's not enough what we're doing? So, you know, that brings this sense of panic that I remember in a conversation with you one day about that maybe my privilege had led me to think that things would always get better.
Yes, well, I come from a different field, of course, you know, where things weren't steady actually for me. And I guess reflecting now, you know, growing up, some of you know, in the Lebanon, and the country was at war. What strikes me is that how much was about managing. You know, that if you weren't coping with the crazy situation around you, then you were either weak or mentally unstable even. And I'm finding actually that same thinking actually in some of my organizational clients that say, you know, if you're not coping, then, you know, you shouldn't be there somehow. And I think it's really important, I feel, to sort of not just sort of stay with that actually there's something rigid that happens when we just stay with the managing, you know. And I think it brings back those two concepts that Dan Siegel talks about, the rigidity and chaos. Actually, in every presentation, there's a bit both. And it's about, you know, not fearing one or the other, because if we go too far towards one polarity, then we're missing something really important. And, you know, growing up, people that just went to the rigid managing actually ended up obviously with a lot of mental health issues and anxiety issues, etc. So it's in the balance of all, isn't it? It's what we're saying. Probably fair to say that sustaining is a combination of both, you know, taken together, you know, not as, you know, as a dialectic tension, you know, and a dialectic tension that responds to, you know, what's happening around you, what the field conditions are. Maybe in a good field, I called for acceptance and I'm more open to acceptance. It's not always the right thing, but whilst in a tougher field, I need to manage myself, and also it's not the right thing. You know, so
that's worth saying again.
Oh, I'm not sure I can actually. Now you put me on the spot.
Well, let me have a go.
Yeah, have a go.
It's one of those lovely sort of, it's like a little koan, you know, that's just come out there about, you know, in a healthy field, in a flourishing field or a thriving field, you know, we can lay back and just sort of acknowledge and take in that expansive sense, but also maybe it's easier to manage. But then in a conflicted, fragmented, sort of toxic or traumatized field, then, you know, in a sense, we don't want to take that in, so we manage more, but that very act of managing is unsustainable in that sort of a field. And I guess what that has been sort of leading me to think about a lot is Gestalt theory. You know, Gestalt theory, this tension that we feel in Gestalt theory between a transformational change process where we sort of say, stay with it, and an increasing emphasis on formulating and treating psychopathology, you know, managing. And, you know, in my background, I sort of have the both. And I find it very difficult to flex between these two and find myself asking, is there a middle ground, or actually are these two different strategies incompatible?
Well, you know, I think I mentioned to you just, you know, in our break that, you know, where that took me in Gestalt theory, which is interesting. And I hope everyone knows a bit about the Gestalt cycle of experience and how much, you know, our theory says that, you know, the Gestalt theory says that, you know, health comes through some sort of self-regulation, some organismic self-regulation. So, you know, in a way, self-regulated is between the individual need and the environment. But when you look at the cycle of experience, often, you know, you say, okay, so what does Gestalt say when the field is not generous, when, you know, there's no water to quench my thirst, or there's no person to hug? You know, what do I do? And in these situations, I guess we can only adapt as best we can. And that's really the creation of a creative adjustment in the best way. You know, the field isn't generous, then we have to be creative and find our own way. And for me, you know, if I stay with the sensation part of the cycle, you know, is this a time where I sense there's not enough support in the field, and therefore what crystallizes is a should, is an introject, is a managing instinct. You know, there's no one there for me, you know, and it's still a kind of, okay, I have to do it alone, or whatever the introjected part is. So, and that's really the managing, you know, and in a way, could we say that managing is actually giving us enough energy to give us the swing to go around the cycle when actually the field isn't supportive enough.
Yes.
And then, of course, when we know from the theory is that when you start from an introjected place, in fact, you won't reach total satisfaction. You know, there's a contact, there's movement, there's change, but actually at the other end of the cycle, there's a place of saying, okay, so I've not had full satisfaction. Let me see what's missing. And this is a time for acknowledging. It's acknowledging the loss of what was. So I think they sit on this cycle, and a letting go. And in the letting go, there's a new need that sort of arises. So I just felt that actually within the human experience, and I positioned them in those places on the cycle, but it feels lovely to have a sustaining, you know, that's what sustains us. Sometimes we need both at different times. And I think it is so much in our dialogue and our ability to access the field that these different strategies should be coming into play, or could come into play rather.
Yeah, I'm just sitting with the richness really of what you've said there. And thinking one way of thinking about that is how we go from a sort of flow, you know, this beautiful flow around a so-called healthy cycle or contact sequence, into a creative adjustment, you know, when the field is maybe not providing quite what we would like, and then maybe what becomes a fixed gestalt, you know, an absolute deeply sedimented pattern of relating. And you also mentioned about needs, and I'm just wanting to bring in again at the last minute that ethics issue of, you know, there's me and my cycle, and then there's, you know, as we say, needs organized perception, but this really interesting point about whose needs, you know, whose needs in a group are organizing what happens next. Where does power and privilege sit in that, in terms of organizing a contact sequence for units more than one?